Twilight settled like a prayer over the mountains of Cinder Hollow. The world was quiet, except for the soft whistle of wind through pine and the faint creak of an old cabin roof holding back another storm. Elias Ward stood outside, sleeves rolled to his elbows, splitting the last of the day's wood. His beard was streaked with silver and ash. His eyes, the color of the worn sky. Once, laughter had filled these hills. His wife, May, humming while stirring stew, her voice catching sunlight the way no one else could. But that was before the fever took her, before silence became the only company he could keep. He stacked the last log, set the axe down, and leaned against the post, letting the mountain air fill his lungs. Sometimes he thought the wind still carried her songs, faint, like a dream he didn't dare wake from. The storm clouds were gathering fast now, heavy with the smell of rain and thunder. The valley below flickered with distant lightning. That's when he heard it, a sound so strange it made his heart pause. A knock. 3 soft, uneven taps at his door. For a long breath, he didn't move. No one ever came this high up the trail, not since the winter of '83, when he'd buried May. He stepped forward slowly, boots scraping against the wood floor, and opened the door. There they stood, a man and a woman, old as winter and twice as weary. The woman's shawl clung to her shoulders, drenched and torn. The man leaned on a carved stick, trembling from cold. Their faces were lined with the kind of years only love and hardship can carve. "Sir," the woman said softly, her voice trembling like the rain behind her, "we can't walk anymore. Could we stay one night?" Elias hesitated. The world had made him cautious, taught him that kindness could cost a man everything. But something in her eyes, gentle, unafraid, cut through the years of silence he'd built around himself. He nodded once and stepped aside. The warmth of the fire welcomed them in. Clara Boone, she said her name was, and her husband Henry. They'd been traveling from Texas, trying to find their daughter who had disappeared somewhere out west. Last word said she'd married a ranch hand near Cinder Hollow. They had no wagon anymore. It had broken down by the creek trail. They'd been walking ever since. Elias offered them a chair by the hearth and ladled stew into 3 bowls. The couple ate slowly, whispering thanks, the firelight turning their tired faces golden. Henry's hands shook as he lifted the spoon, and Elias noticed how Clara steadied him gently, as if every motion between them carried a lifetime of care. When the meal was done, the cabin fell quiet except for the rain tapping the windows. Clara gazed around the small space, the wooden table, the coat hanging by the door, the rocking chair by the fire. Her eyes lingered on the untouched second cup beside it. "You live alone, Mr. Ward?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Been a while." "She must have been kind," Clara said, smiling faintly. "The way you keep her place warm." Elias didn't answer. His throat closed around the truth that some warmth was too sacred to touch. The storm deepened. Lightning flashed beyond the hills, shadows leaping across the cabin walls. The Boones settled near the hearth, drifting into sleep wrapped in borrowed blankets. Elias sat by the window, staring into the dark, his hand unconsciously brushing the old cup by the rocking chair. The smell of stew and rain mingled, and for the first time in years, the silence inside him didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a pause between heartbeats. When dawn came, it painted the sky in silver. The air smelled of wet pine and promise. Elias stepped outside to chop wood and saw smoke curling from his chimney. Down in the valley, townsfolk saw it too. It had been years since anyone saw life up in the Ward place, and the talk began before breakfast. "They say old Ward took in strangers," muttered the storekeeper's wife. "Could be drifters," said another. "Or thieves. Man's been alone too long. No telling what he's up to." But up in the mountains, none of that mattered. Elias helped Henry repair a broken wagon wheel, his large hands steadying the old man's trembling ones. When Henry tried to pay, Elias shook his head. "Just get home safe," he said quietly. Clara insisted on cooking breakfast before they left, biscuits and eggs that filled the cabin with the kind of smell that hurt the heart in a good way. She hummed as she cooked, an old tune from somewhere down south, one May used to hum when spring melted the last of the snow. Elias froze mid-step when he heard it, his chest tightening. He stepped outside, pretending to fetch water, just to breathe. He stood on the porch as sunlight slid over the ridge, warming his face. The world seemed softer somehow, as if the night had washed it clean. Behind him, Clara's voice rose again. Gentle, forgiving, alive. Sometimes, Elias murmured to no one. Grace walks in on tired feet. By mid-morning, the couple was ready to go. Henry thanked him, his hand trembling in Elias's. Clara touched his arm and said, "The world grows smaller as we age, son, but kindness keeps it wide." Elias didn't know what to say. He just nodded, watching them disappear down the trail, two small figures against the green vastness. By noon, word had already reached town that the widower had taken strangers into his cabin. Sheriff Calder Briggs rode up, dust swirling behind his horse, suspicion shadowing his face. He knocked on Elias's door, hat in hand. "All right, Ward," the sheriff said. "Heard you had visitors." Elias simply replied, "Storm caught them. They needed a roof." The sheriff studied him, then the cabin, the extra cup on the table, the second chair. Finally, he tipped his hat and left. When the sound of hooves faded, Elias stood in the doorway for a long while, looking at the trail the couple had taken. He didn't know why he felt a weight in his chest, something like worry or the echo of old loss. The sun hung low, gold spilling over the pines, and the cabin behind him smelled faintly of biscuits and rain. He whispered to the empty room, "Safe travels, you two." And though he didn't know it yet, by the time the next storm rolled in, their names would return to him, carried not by footsteps, but by grief. 2 days passed before word reached the mountain. The sky had just begun to bruise with another storm when Elias heard a frantic knock, the kind that doesn't wait to be answered. A rider from town stood at his door, hat in hand, rain dripping from his beard. "They didn't make it far," he said, voice rough with the news he carried. "The Boones." Wagon went off the creek road down by Cottonwood Bend. Folks found it overturned. Elias didn't ask for details. He didn't even close the door behind him. He just grabbed his coat, his rope, and his horse, and rode out into the gray. The rain came heavy, blinding, the trails slick with mud. But he didn't slow down. He followed the tracks where the creek bent toward the canyon, heart pounding with something fierce and wordless. When he reached the wreck, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and splintered wood. Henry lay beside the wagon, breathing but faint. Clara was nowhere to be seen until he caught the glint of her shawl beneath the broken axle. Her body was pinned, half submerged in water. Elias threw himself into the torrent, muscles screaming as he lifted the wagon enough to pull her free. The river tore at his legs. The cold bit deep, but he didn't stop. He laid her gently on the bank, pressing his ear to her chest until he caught the fragile sound of breath. "Come on," he whispered, voice shaking. "You're not leaving yet." He loaded them both onto his horse and rode back through the storm. One man, two souls clinging to life, and the weight of the mountain pressing around them. By the time he reached his cabin, night had fallen. He laid Henry near the hearth, Clara on his own bed. Her pulse was weak, her face pale as ash. He worked through the night, boiling water, stitching cuts, wrapping them in every blanket he had. When the town doctor arrived at dawn, he shook his head at the sight. "They're too old to fight the mountain, Ward. Best thing you can do is make 'em comfortable." Elias didn't answer. He just kept working, his jaw set, eyes burning with stubborn fire. He spooned broth into Clara's mouth, whispered to her even when she couldn't answer. When exhaustion threatened to take him, he found himself humming low, broken notes of the hymn she'd sung by his fire just days before. Henry lasted 2 more nights. When his breath finally left him, it was gentle, a sigh more than a struggle. He reached for Clara's hand, then for Elias's, and whispered, "Thank you, son." Before the light went out in his eyes, Elias buried him at the edge of the clearing, beneath a pine tree that faced the sunrise. Clara was too weak to stand, but she asked to see the grave from the window. That evening, she called Elias to her bedside. Her voice was barely a breath. "I have one last favor," she said. "Find our daughter, Rosalind. She's in town, working at the Copper Dove. Tell her, her mom is waiting." Elias nodded. He didn't promise out loud, but he saddled his horse before dawn. When he rode into Cinder Hollow, the town went still. It had been years since anyone saw Elias Ward in the daylight. People whispered behind him, eyes sharp with judgment. He tied his horse outside the Copper Dove Saloon, a place heavy with smoke, piano music, and tired laughter. Inside, the air smelled of whiskey and loneliness. Behind the bar, a woman turned at the sound of his boots. a woman with familiar eyes, though life had dimmed them. Rosalind booned that he removed his hat. "Your mother's alive," he said simply, "but she's fading fast." The glass in her hand slipped and shattered. Silence spread through the saloon. She stared at him, disbelief and guilt fighting across her face. Then she whispered, "Take me to her." They rode through snow that night, wind clawing at their coats, lanterns swinging between them. No words were spoken, just the rhythm of hooves and the ache of things left unsaid. When they reached the cabin, Clara was awake, waiting as if she'd known her daughter would come. Her face lit up, frail, but brighter than the fire itself. "Rosie," she whispered. "My sweet girl." Rosalind dropped to her knees beside the bed, taking her mother's trembling hands. There were no grand apologies, no rehearsed speeches, only the raw sound of tears. Clara brushed her daughter's hair back and whispered, "We thought you were lost to shame, but love don't die easy, Rosie. It just waits." Elias turned away, letting them have their moment. He stepped outside and lit lanterns along the porch rail, one for each soul he'd lost, one for May, one for Henry, one for every heart the mountain had tested and spared. Snow began to fall, soft and slow, each flake catching the lantern light like tiny stars. When he returned inside, Clara was quiet. Her eyes, still open, were full of peace. Rosalind held her mother's hand until the warmth faded from it at by dawn. The cabin was still again. But something had changed, not silence anymore, but peace. Elias brewed coffee, the same way he once did for May, and placed 2 cups on the table. One for him, one for Rosalind. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it brought wildflowers up through the soil beside Henry's grave. Rosalind stayed. She helped Elias repair the cabin roof Henry had meant to fix, cooked the same way her mother had, and filled the quiet spaces with her presence. They didn't talk much about grief, or about how mercy had brought them together. Some things didn't need words. In town, the gossip changed its tone. "They say the old man took in the boons and saved the daughter, too. Maybe he's not mad after all. Maybe mercy still lives up there." And so, the story spread. How the widower in the mountains, the one they called a ghost, built lanterns to guide lost souls home. Sometimes travelers still say they see that cabin at night, glowing through the snow like a small sun refusing to die. They don't know the man inside once thought kindness was a weakness. They don't know it saved him. And if you ever find yourself wandering that high road under a winter sky, you might see the light too, warm and patient, waiting, because some hearts don't heal by forgetting. They heal by opening their doors one more time. Some folks build fences, the old ones say. Others build firelight. And sometimes, one night of mercy burns bright enough to warm a lifetime.